So, hello everybody, I hope you can hear me well and you can see me well. It's 7:10 a.m. in Freiburg, Germany. I can see that one of the participants of today's talk, Victoria dos Santos, is already there. So, hello to Professor dos Santos. As I planned for today, we're going to have a first theoretical lecture of 45 minutes, then it's going to be a short break, and then we give the floor to two special guests today. One is Professor dos Santos, who joins us from Italy, and the other one is Professor Dr. Federico Biggio. But first of all, let's start with our, let's say, introduction and theoretical talk. We are going through the different subjects of this advanced course in critical semiotics. Today I would like to start from a Chinese text, in particular from a poem by an author that I like and enjoy, and that matters enormously to me, the 8th century poet Tu Fu. So in one of his poems, 8th century Tu Fu, among the greatest of world literature, sublimely evokes the young soul's longing for an all-encompassing vision of existence. Tu Fu's lines are so subtle that they cannot be properly paraphrased. They must be quoted, albeit in the elegant 2016 revised English translation by David Hawkes. And dear Chinese friends and colleagues, you of course have the wonderful chance to be able to read this poem in the original text. So the poem is entitled Wan Yue, where wan means to gaze at, usually at faraway objects, and yue is a word that might specifically refer to one of the 5 great peaks of China. In this case, yue refers to Taishan in the eastern region of Shandong. Here is the text of the poem. Let's quote. It's a perfect poem to start the class at 7 a.m. in the morning. So I quote, "How is one to describe this king of mountains? Throughout the whole of Qi and Lu, one never loses sight of its greenness. In it, the Creator has concentrated all that is numinous and beautiful. Its northern and southern slopes divide the dawn from the dark. The layered clouds begin at the climber's heaving chest, and homing birds fly suddenly within range of his straining eyes. One day I must stand on top of its highest peak, and at a single glance see all the other mountains grown tiny beneath me." End of quote. I'm always a little bit touched emotionally when I read Tu Fu's poems. It's strange because it's from another culture, another language, another century, but I feel a close connection to this poet. In particular, I feel attached by this last line, "One day I must stand on top of its highest peak, and at a single glance see all the other mountains grown tiny beneath me," which expresses a concept that can be uneasily translated, paraphrased into other words. The greatness of poetry is perhaps consists in the fact that it says what it says so precisely and so densely that it cannot be translated, it cannot be paraphrased. But if I had to encompass what the meaning of this last line is, in my words and to my opinion, I would say that it expresses the human longing for something very close to what a certain Western aesthetics, Western philosophy has called the sublime. But at the same time, these two concepts, on the one hand, the sublime in Western philosophy and Western aesthetics, and on the other hand, the idea that emerges from this last line of the poem are different because, the poem bestows on this idea, the Chinese version of this idea, some concreteness, some natural skin. We see the poet imagining himself at the peak of a mountain and then embrace with a single glance all the other mountains that have grown tiny beneath. It is the dream of an all-encompassing view. It is the dream of reaching a point in life from which one could have a bird's view of the existence. Of course, this dream cannot be fulfilled because as long as we are in the existence, we cannot see it from above. But nevertheless, the poet seems to convey this idea that human beings, and especially the most delicate one, the most refined one, the poets, although they must acknowledge this impossibility, they still cultivate it. They still cultivate the dream of being able to encompass at a single glance the entire scenery, the entire landscape. And interpretations of this poem have, of course, accumulated throughout the centuries, yet no one has been able to rule out that its lines fundamentally hint at a crucial hope of humankind, as I was saying, at the aspiration that in the course of one's life, through spiritual exertion, a grounded view of existence might be gained. But from a certain point of view, that might also be your own ambition, dear colleagues and friends and students, especially young students. Those of you who want to become scholars, probably they have deep down in their spirit, in their soul, this longing for gaining an all-encompassing view. Of course, that is impossible, but it's good to have it as a goal. So, what is the relation between this line and the wish, the desire, the ambition, the aspiration that it expresses, and our advanced graduate course in critical semiotics? Well, semiotics too has at its peak, when it was on top of the mountain, or at least it thought it was on top of the mountain, it dreamt of developing an all-encompassing view of something that is wonderful but tremendously complicated scenery, which is meaning. Semiotics in the 1960s and especially in the 1970s, for instance, in the Paris school, surrounded this Franco-Lithuanian semiotician, Gerdas, Julien, Crémas. Well, it dreamt of developing a discourse and a method to explain and understand and interpret any kind of meaning, every kind of meaning. Of course, this proved quite impossible to attain, but at the same time, cultivating this ambition has allowed semiotics to come up with a new way of looking at culture, with a new way of looking at literature, with a new way of looking at history as well. So today I would like to contribute myself to this unfolding by reference to another Chinese text this time not a classical poem by Tu Fu, but a contemporary text. There is a Chinese text that I've read in the English translation and that really impressed me. I believe that contemporary Chinese literature is tremendously creative and inspiring, especially in relation to the depiction of what we could define the uncanny or the unheimlich, as Freud would designate it. So in Chinese science fiction, for instance, and my friend and colleague Professor Zhang is a great scholar studying. Zhang Jun is a great scholar about this field. Professor Zhang Jun has written several articles about science fiction in Chinese literature and other articles about contemporary Chinese literature. But today I would like to concentrate on one text in particular, which is translated into English as The Invisibility Cloak by Jie Fei, published in 2016. The plot of the novel is relatively simple. There is a man of modest means that falls in love and marries a beautiful girl who, after a certain time, however, leaves him for another man. It's a very common story. The process of mourning that follows entails for the main character an excruciating introspection, a constant imaginary dialogue with a defunct mother who had to warn the protagonist about the unsuitableness of the bride, and always listen to your mother before you get married. And above all, exquisite digressions, and this is the novelty and also the postmodern element of this novel, some exquisite long digressions on the technical characteristics of stereo systems, so systems that are used to listen to music. Indeed, this is the job of the protagonist. He assembles and sells for work these high-fidelity stereo systems. Probably you listen to music, Western music, Chinese music. I like Chinese music, traditional Chinese music, very much. But if you are really keen on listening to music, you don't want to just listen to music with your iPhone and your earphones. You want a stereo system that reproduces the sound with impeccable fidelity. So, you see, this discloses to us already an isotopy. What is isotopy? According to Grimas, an isotopy is the line of semantic coherence that we can find in a text. Why? Because on the one hand, we have a protagonist who is suffering from lack of faithfulness and fidelity. His wife cheated on him and left. And on the other hand, there is this quest for a technical fidelity in the reproduction of music and sounds. So readers and also literary critics have been marveled by the way in which Jie Fei intertwines these two aspects. So on the one hand, meditations on the impermanence of sentiments, with, on the other hand, on the other level, incredibly detailed descriptions of the technology of musical reproduction. I'll give you an example. I'll quote a little passage from this novel, in which the protagonist expounds on the ideal space where to situate a superb hi-fi stereo built for kind of an ambiguous tycoon, a sort of mafia tycoon. I quote, "In a previous telephone conversation, I had asked Ding Kai-chen to describe the layout of his living room. The floor-to-ceiling window on the south worried me. As I'm sure you know, glass is terrible at containing sound. Sound waves bounce off the glass to create interference that ruins the final stereo imaging effect. Ding Kai-sheng followed my advice and installed a thick curtain in front of the south wall. As you can see, Ding Kai-sheng clearly seemed to be a reasonable man, open to suggestions. His living room, though spacious, didn't provide a favorable listening environment for enjoying music. Usually, the best place to position a speaker would be along the shortest wall of the room. But the shortest walls in this room were on the east and west ends, and they had no empty space. The west wall was occupied by a tower air conditioner which couldn't be moved easily, and next to it a colossal fish tank complete with softly undulating water plants and two eel-like animals swimming back and forth. So as you can see, in these and other passages, the author goes on and on about such acoustic requirements, often presenting the reader with long lists of technical names and specifics. So the protagonist seems to be after the assembling of the perfect stereo system, where all the components from CD player to speakers to cables, without neglecting their ideal positioning in space, contribute to the immaculately faithful reproduction of sounds, without any interference, without any distortion, without any noise. So the utopia of the protagonist is after exactly the utopia of a musical environment in which all noise is eliminated for the sake of guaranteeing the absolute pristineness of sound reproduction. Now, you must know that these talks of ours are recorded twice. They're recorded on the Chinese side, but they're also recorded on this side. So they're recorded by Nie Xichang, but they're also recorded by myself. When I edit these videos for the benefit of my students and colleagues, of course I try to give videos the best quality of sound possible. But it is impossible, even with a good camera, even with a perfect editing instrument, to eliminate every kind of noise. There is always a little noise that stays in videos. Now, it's going to be night for you, much earlier than for me. Tonight, as you are in your house or in your apartment in Shanghai or in another city of China, try to listen to the night, and you'll realize that even in the quieter space, even in the most silent place, there is always noise at night. There is always a tapestry of sounds that compose the little humming of night noise. So this is a metaphor, of course, but it's an interesting metaphor. You see, we can technologically create perfect silence. There are some silence rooms that are used for experiments, but they must be technologically created through the creation of a noise vacuum. And an interesting thing is that if you put a human being within one of these silent chambers, this human being will feel very soon extremely uncomfortable. Usually people want to get out of these silent rooms after, let's say, 20 minutes or half an hour. They feel incredibly uncomfortable. Why? Because they realize that when perfect silence is created all around them, then they start to hearing the sounds of their own body. They start to be able to hear the sounds that the human body normally produces, the sounds of the stomach, the sounds of the lungs. But also, when this silence is absolutely complete all around them in these technological silence rooms, people start to hear the beating of the heart. And this is, of course, unbearable for most people. We are usually worried when we can hear the noise of our own heart. We believe that something is wrong. We want our heart to be silent. We don't want to hear it. So, you see, poets, in a way, cultivate this impossible dream, this perhaps also dangerous dream of listening to one's heart. This is the thread, the common thread that we can detect between this 8th century Chinese poem, Tofu, who dreams of climbing the highest peak of the highest mountain and then with a single gaze encompass the entire scenery. And on the other hand, Jie, this 20th century novelist, who tells a story that on the one hand witnesses to the disruption, the wrecking, the catastrophe of this dream, sentiments, relations, a wedding, a marriage do not count anymore. They do not stand for fidelity. But on the other hand, it also narrates this persistence of the very human idea of a cognitive sublime, the idea of encompassing everything with one gaze, the idea of being able to see all the scenery all together. The metaphor that is used by the novelist is different. It's not a scopic metaphor, so it's not a metaphor that is based on gaze, seeing all the mountains, but it is a metaphor that is based on an acoustic dimension. So being able to listen to perfect music, being able to eliminate all sound, being able to hear sounds in the perfect way. But the two metaphors, although the one on the gaze, so a visual metaphor, and the other one on hearing, so an acoustic metaphor, they somehow converge toward the same point, which is this idea of the cognitive but also the emotional sublime, the idea of eliminating all imperfection from human cognition, but also all imperfection from human passions. This is a long stride that philosophers have undertaken, and of course it is an impossible stride. So, what is the relation of this metaphor based on a perfect gaze on the one hand, and metaphor based on a perfect hearing on the other hand, with critical semiotics? Well, critical semiotics, from a certain point of view, also dreams of reaching an all-encompassing view of culture, of all the ganglia of society, of all the aspects of the semiosphere, in order to perfectly understand, without any bias, without any noise, how meaning is produced in a society. This is, of course, impossible. We cannot, there are no mountains in the semiosphere. We cannot climb on top of a mountain and then look at the semiosphere from above. The semiosphere is, within this metaphor, geologically flat. We are doomed to be at the same level, or almost at the same level, of the objects that we analyze. Yet, we can perhaps get inspiration from this 20th century novel about acoustic fidelity to claim that interpretation as well, which is a key word of our course, can be treated somehow acoustically. So we can think about interpretation as we think about reproduction of sounds. Of course, we don't want to reproduce sounds when we interpret, but we want somehow to reproduce meaning. We want to grasp the meaning of a novel, for instance, in the best possible way, exactly as we want to hear the sound of a song in a best possible way, eliminating all the noise. It's impossible, but we try to. We seek for this perfection in a acoustic reception on the one hand, and interpretive, hermeneutic reception on the other hand. So, I would like to conclude today, before giving the floor to our distinguished guest, to point out that interpretation too can be articulated according to different degrees of fidelity. So, on the one hand, we would have hi-fi interpretation, high-fidelity interpretation. Literary criticism, high-fidelity interpretation is one that doesn't impose an interpretation upon the text, with an attitude that my colleague and friend, the former vice president of the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, Professor Zhang Jian, perfectly characterizes in his articles, the beautiful article that he wrote on imposed interpretation. But hi-fi interpretation is also one that doesn't use literary texts for purposes that they have not been created for, as Umberto Eco, the Italian semiotician scholar, first underlined, distinguishing between the interpretation of texts and their use. But this, on the contrary, this high-fidelity interpretation, an interpretation that adopting such or such theory to gain a framework in which to operate, does not mistake the text for the framework, but sees the text within the framework, as a painting is seen in a frame. It is an interpretation that accepts to perceive the similarities that the theory points at in terms of semantic scaffolding, narrative structure, discursive organization, and so on and so forth, in all the layers of Grimas's semiotics, but then goes beyond it. For it is precisely in this beyond the theory, that the text's contribution to humanity consists. Ultimately, a text, especially a literary text, an artistic text, a creative text, even a philosophical text, matters to us, matters to culture, because of its singularity, because it is unique. It is not completely unique, but there is a part of it, the most sublime part of it, that escapes the grids of theory. So this beyond, where the singularity of the text lies and hides as well, could not be grasped without, sifting the text through the sieve of theory, as you when sieve flour, for instance, or other kinds of food. And yet, this beyond of the text is the most precious content. It is the content that escapes the grids of the theory. So the purpose of high-fidelity interpretation is paradoxical, because on the one hand, we want to be extremely faithful to the text, and for that purpose, we try to come up with the best theoretical frame to read it. But on the other hand, if we want to completely grasp the singularity of this text, at some stage, we must abandon theory and grasp what theory cannot actually model in the text, which is its utmost inner singularity, what the text says that no other text says. There are not too many texts, artistic, literary, in the history of humankind that have these qualities, but think about Guernica, the wonderful painting by Picasso that depicts in a sublime way the Nazi bombing on the Basque village of Guernica. This is a unique painting, and for that we treasure it. We can of course analyze it through semiotic theory, but at some point, at some stage, we must give up theory to a witness to the uniqueness of this painting, to the fact that this painting says something unique about life, death, about violence, peace, war, about injustice. So there are other kinds of interpretation, though. There is not only hi-fi interpretation, there is also lo-fi interpretation. You know, when you download music from the internet, you can choose whether to download hi-fi musical files or lo-fi musical files. And what is then a low-fidelity interpretation? Well, a low-fidelity interpretation, it is one in which love for the literary text and the specificity it enshrines is replaced by passion for other elements, such as the supposed mind of the supposed author, the socio-cultural context in which the text was created, the reception of it in such or such epoch, or the theory that is used to interpret it. All these elements, of course, are precious and give rise to insightful approaches to literature, psychoanalysis of literature, sociology of literature, reception studies, deconstructionist readings, including feminist, queer approaches. And yet, they somehow fall short of grasping the beyond of the theory, that singular content that the literary text conceals and discloses only to the most faithful and devoted readers. You see, when I read the 8th century poems by Tu Fu, there is an emotion in my soul, there is a commotion that cannot really be theoretically explained. It is something that goes beyond the text, that needs the text, but goes beyond it. It goes beyond my Italian culture, it goes beyond Chinese culture. It is something extremely mysterious that words put together in a certain way allow the text to somehow spell out. And then there is also something that is called no-fi interpretation. So hi-fi interpretation, low-fi interpretation. What is no-fi interpretation? No-fi is a term used to refer to musical creations in which poor technical equipment involving the production of noise and distorted sounds is adopted on purposely, so as to turn acoustic chaos into the element of a subversive aesthetics, so shuffling away the criteria established canons and normative poetics of reproduction. So the playfulness of these practices is undeniable, but also their dependence from mainstream aesthetics. You see, Derrida, for instance, clearly had not simply a lo-fi interpretation. He was a theoretical genius. So he wasn't short of elements and knowledge and skills and in talent to interpret texts. He just didn't want to interpret texts according to the myth of high fidelity. He embraced, on the contrary, a no-fidelity aesthetics, which nevertheless, if you follow Umberto Eco, somehow depends also on high fidelity. So you can choose of producing sounds that actually are mostly noise. So you can choose to have a no-fidelity interpretation, but only if you know, or at least you have a model in mind of what high fidelity is. So no-fidelity is always a sort of a counter-interpretive exercise. And then last but not least, there is also a fourth model of interpretation. So we had hi-fi, lo-fi, no-fi. The fourth model is something that we all know, very precious in these times of pandemic. It's called Wi-Fi interpretation. What is Wi-Fi interpretation? Wi-Fi interpretation is a metaphor of mine, of course, of my creation. It is based on the idea that our interpretation is now not based on a living community anymore. We don't see each other anymore. We don't meet anymore. It is an interpretation based on a community of interpreters which is completely Wi-Fi. So we interpret at large, we interpret remotely. And this is one of the key problems of our days, whether we can still interpret texts and be faithful to them and treasure this idea of fidelity if we are not together as a community. This is a big problem. Well, China is still a community, so it might be less of a problem in China than in the West. But now I've talked a lot, and I hope you were able to follow this journey into classic Chinese poetry, contemporary Chinese literature, hermeneutics, semiotics. It is time for us to take a reflection on these matters, but also to move forward. Indeed, as always, we have guests today, and the two guests that we have today perfectly fit into the topic of our lesson, because they are becoming experts in advanced digital technologies of meaning. Experts not from the point of view of the technical skills, so the ICTs, of course they know a lot also about technology, but about the social and especially semiotic consequences of these new technologies. So I ended my part of the talk with this reference to the Wi-Fi interpretation. So, but what happens in a society, what happens to meaning in a society when interpretation is mostly Wi-Fi, when interpretation is mostly carried on by digital communities? What happens to culture when it goes digital? And so we're going to have two contributions. The one by Victoria dos Santos, who is a member of our research group in Turin. She's originally from a beautiful country called Venezuela, but she has an international career and upbringing because she studied in Spain, she studied in the United States. She worked as a professional journalist, and then we had the great pleasure, honor, and chance to actually have her as a member of our research group in Turin. And she's developing a research project that is extremely original because she investigates how culture develops through new digital frameworks, and in particular, how some very central and very traditional, very old elements of culture, such as religion, for instance, developed through these frameworks. So, in particular, she's working on something that is called Techno Paganism, so the resurgence of some old spiritual ideas within new technological frameworks, but also on other subjects that always connect these two elements, the digital progress in communication technology and the evolution of traditional cultures, including the religious ones. The second guest is Federico Biggio, who's going to show up later. He has the chance to sleep a little bit longer, and he is focusing in particular on extended reality, on augmented reality, on virtual reality from an aesthetic and semiotic point of view. You see, for semiotics, it is extremely interesting to work on this topic, to work on virtual reality, for instance, not only because there are tremendous professional opportunities in this field. You know that in the field of entertainment, the production and marketing of video games is now the most booming industry, and it's going to be more and more because, you see, the cinema industry is, of course, in a moment of crisis. It has to reshape, In many countries, people cannot go to the movies anymore, so watching the movies is becoming a private experience. But on the other hand, video games and playing with video games is an activity that was already private and is going to continue during the pandemic even more. So video games are becoming also important from the point of view of the traditional academe, because even philosophers have realized that there is a world in video games. But from the semiotic point of view, what matters the most is that you see, semiotics was created around the idea of the text, and in particular around the idea of the literary text. So all the, let's say, early articles of semiotics, all the early books of semiotics are about literature. So the idea was to interpret literature in a different way than traditional scholarship would do.
Some problems with his connection, so...
I'm back. Sorry about that. My VOOV crashed. So this is also an example of how a Wi-Fi community encounters sometimes some problems. You know, our connection is always unstable because it's based on other agencies, on algorithmic digital agencies. So, but what happens to meaning when meaning is not actually taken from a text, from the reading of a literary text, for instance, but on the contrary is linked to other kinds of textual experiences which are hypertextual, but even more than hypertextual, deeply involve the body, the proprioception, the perception of the body, the senses. You know, when you are in a virtual reality setting with a helmet, most of your senses are stimulated in a way that cannot be compared to the reading of a novel. So on the one hand, in researches like those by Federico Biggio and others in our group, we claim that there is continuity, so we can still use semiotics to analyze what goes on when we are surrounded by an experience of virtual reality. On the other hand, we understand that new instruments, new tools, new frameworks must be created in order to grasp what happens to meaning in digital environments. So I apologize for the little technical problem. We're going to have now a short break. So I've been talking now for 45 minutes, more or less. We're going to take a break at 7:55 here, 10 minutes, and we are going to start again at 5 past. 5 past both in Germany, in Italy, and in China, okay? So please, let's have a 10 minutes break, and after this 10 minutes break, we'll all come back and listen to Victoria dos Santos, who's going to present us, and I thank her very much for being here with us today. It's as if we were in Shanghai, so now our perception of the place is actually a decision. So we decide today that we are in Shanghai, because the majority of us is probably in Shanghai. So in 10 minutes we resume and we give the floor to Victoria dos Santos. Thank you very much and see you in 10 minutes sharp.